You're listening to Myers-Briggs Question Corner with Edythe Richards. Hello listeners, welcome to another weekly podcast of Myers-Briggs Question Corner. Now, today's question is one of my own, and I'm hoping Edythe can shed some light on this. It's a topic we've discussed many times in the past, but it's the one I believe continues to be misunderstood. So, let me first welcome Edythe. How are you?
Hello, listeners, and hello, David. I'm doing well, thanks. I'm intrigued by your question. Anything related to Myers-Briggs, you know I'm always up for that challenge, so bring it on.
I'll take that as my cue. So, Edythe, my question relates to introverts and extroverts. You've talked before about their brains being wired differently, and how that affects how they prefer to engage with the world around them. This can also lead to a preference for communicating in a certain way, how they choose to spend their free time, and even the types of jobs and work environments they move into. That's a preamble to my actually very simple question. How can we recognise, just by looking at them, who is the extrovert and who is the introvert?
That's a great question, David, and I've got a very clear answer for you. Are you ready?
Oh, indeed I am.
Great. Well, here's my answer. There is no surefire way to tell.
I was afraid you were going to say that. But Edythe, if I'm curious about this question, and I most certainly am, and I'm sure our listeners are too, could you expand on this answer? Maybe give our listeners some clues to a person's type.
I thought you'd never ask. Let's first talk about what introversion and extroversion really are in terms of the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator Assessment. There are always a lot of misconceptions about this dichotomy, and I feel like it's my mission in life to set the record straight.
It really is a lesson worth repeating, multiple times.
Yes, it is. I'm going to talk about some behaviors that may be associated with extroverted and introverted types specifically, and ways you may consider approaching them so that you don't scare them off and engage with them fully.
Okay, sounds good. Oh, and before we move on, Edythe, if I may.
Sure.
We have a few related podcasts that I'd really like to cite. Why did my Myers-Briggs type change? And one type at home and another type at work. I'm going to provide links to these podcasts in the listening notes, in case anyone tuning in would like to listen to those too.
Excellent idea. Thank you, David. So the Myers-Briggs assessment is about preferences, meaning which side comes more easily and more naturally to you. Just like you have a preference for either your right hand or your left hand, you also have a preference for extroversion or introversion, but you use both in your everyday life. Now, according to most personality type theories, your preference for introversion or extroversion is inborn and doesn't change. However, you can and should develop traits and habits that differ or even directly contradict your natural preferences.
Yes, this is where a lot of people get it wrong, isn't it? We naturally look at an assessment like the Myers-Briggs as a determining factor or a way to predict something, and it really doesn't do this.
No, there are other assessments out there that are predictive, but the Myers-Briggs isn't one of them. If we come back to the definition of introversion and extroversion, again, we use both, but one is easier and more natural for us than the other. So is it easier for you to become energized externally by the external environment of people and things, and do you get energized by taking action? Or are you energized internally by time alone and reflection and need that alone time to process?
Well, now of course, if you're asking me, Edythe, you already know that my preference is for introversion. And I'm very clear on that. As I've learned more about this though, I've realised it may not be so clear-cut for a lot of other people.
Well, I happen to be one of those people. So I grew up with a very introverted mother who didn't encourage a lot of group activities, team sports, or socializing, but she did encourage individual creative pursuits and reading. We lived on a farm, and there weren't a lot of other kids for me to play with. And I remember getting really bored over the summers because of the lack of external stimulation. And unlike a lot of kids, I was so ready for school to start up again so I'd have other kids to hang around again. I used to beg my parents to move us to a real neighborhood so I could be around more people and exposed to more activities. But when you're a child, you can't really articulate these things or think about them in terms of how you're personally wired and what you can do to compensate.
Obviously, it's an introvert thing, Edythe, but I have to tell you, a childhood like that sounds pretty amazing to me. But that's not the case for an extrovert. So, what happened? How did you compensate? Or indeed, did you?
Yeah, good question. I have to say that I was a very shy and awkward child. It wasn't until I got involved in drama and being on stage in high school that I felt like I gained a voice, literally.
Yeah, nice. But at the same time, you learned the introverted side of things, didn't you?
Absolutely, I did. I got very comfortable in that world. I'm still a huge reader to this day, and my creativity is one of my strengths that I'm really proud of. But that's certainly not to say that an introvert can't be creative or a reader. That's not what the introversion-extroversion dichotomy is measuring. Introversion does not equate to shyness or a dislike of being around people or loneliness. Introverts can network very well. They can be fantastic public speakers and enjoy meeting new people.
Right, I get that. But what you're saying about your childhood makes me think that extroversion and introversion are probably very easy to spot in children. Would you say that's true?
Well, in my opinion, yes, much more so than the other three dichotomies of the Myers-Briggs. If we think about it, there really are two kinds of children. The kid who's really vocal and goes up to strangers or other kids easily and wants to play with other kids, that kid is probably very expressive. There's no doubt how he or she is feeling. And then there's the introverted child who is perfectly happy to play alone with his trucks or draw or play alone with her dolls, whatever it is she does. And they're kind of off in their own little worlds.
Interesting. Well, I definitely had introverted tendencies as a child. I used to love to sit in the stairs and play with action men and things on my own. I think they're called G.I. Joe in your part of the world. I love to draw, put things together, Lego, build things, but I did do them all by myself. If other kids came in, I felt like things wouldn't continue correctly. I felt like they didn't know how to do it right, or they would just mess things up.
Well, not much has changed, has it, David?
Nice. So, back to the original question then. Edythe, as adults, how can we recognize an extrovert or an introvert?
So again, no surefire way, but here are some clues to spotting extroverts. A big one is that they do their thinking while speaking, and this is all part of their thought process. Extroverts don't mind talking about their problems to others. They're often more willing to express themselves openly. They may ask people personal questions to get to know them better, such as, tell me about your job, your hobbies, your family. They're not doing this to be nosy, but to show the other person they're interested in them.
That can be hard for we introverts to accept. I don't want to ask those kinds of personal questions to strangers, because I don't want them to think I'm prying.
Right, that's where misunderstandings can occur. As an extrovert, I can tell you that my default is to take that lack of talking as a lack of interest.
Well, Edythe, that really could be the case sometimes. But generally speaking, we wouldn't mean to come across that way.
And it's the same for extroverts like myself. We don't mean to be nosy and inconsiderate. It's just our way of trying to get to know someone. Extroverts also favor an energetic atmosphere. They're not going to do their best work when they're alone or solving problems by themselves. They do need a certain amount of group interaction. If they don't get enough interaction, it's quite stressful for the extrovert, and they can become depressed or even apathetic.
These differences are massive, and it's clearly very different for we introverts. And to be clear, I do like a good party or a social gathering every now and then, but even though I might really enjoy myself, they do drain me.
Understand. So One way to spot an introvert at a social gathering or party, see how they react later in the evening or towards the end of the event. They may get more tired than their extroverted friends, or they may come out of a large interaction and drift off into a deeper conversation with one or two other people they know well, or they may get up and take a break.
I'm also thinking, and this is at least true for me, if I'm out in public, I do tend to avoid making eye contact with other people, especially on public transport. I'll sit as far away from people as possible. I know that sounds terrible.
Right, and an extrovert like myself will be more apt to go up to a stranger and start a conversation. And you know what, David? There's one question I like to ask people that can determine their preference for extroversion or introversion. Are you ready?
Of course, I sure am. This will be interesting. By all means, fire away.
Okay, how much time can you take being alone without talking to or texting anyone before you actively seek out interaction with someone else?
Nice one. For me, it's, it could be days, I suppose. I could easily go a week or two without contact, and I wouldn't have any problems.
Wow, I'd go nuts. For me, it's somewhere between half a day and 3/4 of a day.
Well, that is a massive difference. So the more time you can be alone without being crazy, the more likely you are to be an introvert.
Yes, that's right. Again, not a hard science here, but still things to be aware of that can help your interaction with others.
And speaking of interacting with others, Edythe, how about sharing some tips for interaction?
Sure. Let's start with tips for things introverts can do to engage better with extroverts. First, let us talk. Remember that we extroverts process our thoughts out loud, and what you hear may not be completely well thought out, but it is our way to communicate. Second, you can paraphrase what we say or ask us some questions. For example, so what you're saying is that you really still do like playing with Barbies, Edythe? Or could you tell me more about what you do for a living? This lets us know that you are interested in what we have to say. Third, give us visible or verbal acknowledgement. Don't just stare at us like we suddenly grew another head or look at us with a blank expression. We may wrongly assume that this is disinterest or, in a work situation, a lack of preparation on your part.
Those are good points, for me especially, to remember. Thank you, Edythe. Now, if I can point out, we have another podcast entitled 5 Simple Ways Introverts Can Engage with Extroverts. And I'll include a link for this too, as it may help out our fellow introvert listeners.
Excellent. Thank you, David.
Okay, and Edythe, if it's okay with you, I'll take the reins here for the best ways to engage with introverts.
Please do. I'd love to hear from an introvert's point of view.
Okay, great. Now, first, and I can't stress this one enough, give us time to prepare. We're in our heads a lot, and we need time to process everything before we verbalize it. 2, please don't put us on the spot. If there's anything I really have trouble with, it's being singled out in a group. It's just going to make me retreat into my shell and disengage perhaps from you completely. 3, don't assume that just because we're quiet that we don't have good ideas or something to share. We just need to be approached in the right way, I guess. Oh, and yes, we are listening and we do hear you. Just because we don't respond in the way you're looking for isn't an invitation to start shouting or talking on and on.
Oh yes, I've heard that one before. Thanks, David. Those are great tips and good reminders.
And with that, I think we've come to the end of another episode. Edythe, many thanks for your insight. To our listeners, thanks again for tuning in. If you find this podcast helpful, please do us a favour and share it with others that you know. And if you haven't done so already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or Player FM or wherever you get your podcasts, so you won't miss any future episodes. And you can always go back in time and catch up with previous shows. Many thanks. Thanks for listening to this episode. If you'd like to hear more, or you'd like to submit a question yourself, then you can find us at www.atopcareer.com. Until next time. MBTI and Myers-Briggs are registered trademarks of the MBTI Trust.